regarding the call. Stand by for us beginning in a few moments. This is Edward Jones, Director of Programs for ABFE. Good day, everyone. This is Edward Jones, Director of Programs for ABFE, and on behalf of ABFE, I'd like to welcome you all to today's Third Thursday conversation, where we're going to talk about embracing equity. It's One Funded's journey. On behalf of ABFE, we welcome you and appreciate your joining us for this call and the latest in the series of Third Thursday webinars that we've been hosting since 2014. Part of these webinars is really to enlighten and inform the community, inform our members, as well as to carry forth conversations that become perspectives that we hope will resonate with attendees and participants, and also help to change outcomes and improve lives in Black communities, and as an extension, all communities that we support, serve, and live in. I am Edward Jones. I'm joined by my colleague, Bianca Alston, and we have today with us a great perspective on this work as we talk about racial equity at ABFE daily. We're going to learn more about One Funded's journey, as the title of this webinar is, and bring this conversation to us today is Annette Sykes, who has recently been promoted to the title of Director of Race, Equity, and Inclusion at the Annie E. Casey Foundation. So I'm going public with the congratulations for that, and also like to say, sounds like you are the right one for this task. Those of you that will listen into this call today, just note that we do have all the phones on mute, so as not to have distractions such as outside calls and such interrupt the call. We will also have, if you'll notice on the right side of your screen, a chat room that allows you to pose questions. And at the appointed time of this call, we will open up to field those questions that come in. So if you want to practice, if you want to prepare to post questions as you hear this call, we invite you to do so by using the chat function on the right-hand side of your screen. So without further ado, I'd like to hear and introduce to you all Annette Sykes as she brings their journey towards embracing equity. Welcome aboard, and thank you, Annette.
Thank you, Edward, and I'm honored and excited to be with you guys today and to be able to share our story with you guys and share our story while we're in the moment. Although we've been in this work for a while, we've had a lot of exciting and interesting changes that have occurred just recently, so it's a great opportunity to be able to share them with you. So why don't we get started, and Bianca, if you'll advance us to the next slide. What you see on the screen is essentially the Annie E. Casey Foundation's mission. And as you see here, the Casey Foundation is really devoted to making sure that all children in the United States have a bright future. We know that this is a pretty lofty goal, but we think it is achievable with national and local partners who are committed to changing the life trajectory for millions of children who are at risk of poor educational, economic, social, and health outcomes. And for us, I think it's important to really note here that we're really talking about the majority of these low-income families being children of color and people of color. Next slide. So for those of you who may not be familiar with the Casey Foundation and our work, Casey really does have a strong history and a reputation on addressing issues of equity, diversity, and inclusion throughout our work. For the last 20 years or so, our work has really touched on issues of how do we advance equity and inclusion in a number of ways. And what you see on this screen is just some examples of the ways or approaches that we've been able to advance the work. Some of you may have heard of our internal affinity group called RESPECT that's really working to help change and transform our organizational culture to one that embraces diversity, and equity, and inclusion. We've developed a number of tools over the years. The Race Matters Toolkit is probably one of our most notable and one that's been used by a lot of other organizations over time and modified in ways that can help advance their own internal work. In that final bottom box, you'll see just a few other examples of some strategic grant-making efforts in which we've really tried to work hard to reduce the overrepresentation of kids of color in programs like our child welfare and our juvenile justice efforts. Next slide. Here you see the composition of the current demographics of what's about 74 million children in the United States who make up the child population that we really focus on. And you see what it is expected to be in 2015, 2030, and 2050. And the point I want to make in showing you this slide is that children of color are going to be the majority of children in the United States in just a few years. And we will not be able to achieve, and I'm speaking for the Casey Foundation, we will not be able to achieve the kind of improved outcomes we want to see and well-being for all kids if we don't pay attention to the needs of kids of color. So we see our race equity and inclusion work as being critical to achieving the Foundation's mission going forward. And I'll also say here, it took us a lot of years and a lot of work for the Foundation to really fully come to that realization and to acknowledge the fact that we'll never be able to achieve our mission without incorporating a race equity inclusion lens in every facet of our work going forward. Next slide. So knowing that the data on the previous slide was trending, we spent a lot of time in 2012 in what we were calling a listening and a learning mode, which included interviewing Casey staff from across the Foundation, interviewing a number of race equity thought leaders across the country like John Powell and Manuel Pastor and Angela Glover Blackwell and others, engaging with national, regional, and community foundations that are funding some racial equity efforts, and we host 2 consultative sessions. And we really did that research to help us better understand the challenges and opportunities in the racial equity space, to better understand the role that Casey could play in the next generation of this work, and to also better understand the various frames that were being used in the field. And so we think, as you can see here on the top slide, that the equitable opportunities frame is the most effective frame for Casey, not only because it checks all of those boxes you see there around us, being results-focused and actionable and child and family-centered, inclusive and aspirational, but it's also based on the premise that all children deserve a fair chance to achieve his or her potential in life. This frame does not lead with disparities data about unequal outcomes that we find can oftentimes reinforce negative stereotypes and can place blame on the child or their parent. We believe the equitable opportunities frame is one that is rooted in removing the structural barriers and the institutional barriers that prevent access to greater opportunity and access to identifying solutions for full opportunity. So when we looked and when we did our consultative sessions and we did the research on the field, these frameworks were the most prevailing, those around equitable opportunity, closing disparity gaps, increasing diversity, and changing demographics. But for us, we really felt that the equitable opportunities frame was the frame that Casey should lead with. Next slide. And so that allowed us to move away from disparities language and move towards language that really focuses on strategies that increase equity and equitable opportunity for all children. So what you see here is how we are defining race equity and inclusion. And for us, it really is a portfolio that's focused on supporting all children to achieve their full potential in life, regardless of their race, their ethnicity, or their community of residence. And at Casey, all of the work that we do in all of our portfolios must have a theory of change and a hypothesis that guides the work. So for our race equity and inclusion portfolio, our hypothesis is that if Casey creates and disseminates data products, develops and disseminates best practices and resources, and also advances policy and practice changes, then we feel like we are likely to see increased equitable opportunities for all the children and families that we're serving. Next slide. So what you see here is how our race equity and inclusion strategies roll up to our larger results for our talent and leadership development unit where the REI portfolio sits, which also rolls up to the foundation-wide result, which is all U.S. children have bright futures. So again, our REI strategies are that we are creating and disseminating data products, we're developing and disseminating best practices and resources, and we're working to advance policy and practice changes. And this approach, we feel like, creates the necessary culture internally for the foundation to sustain our efforts. And this work is both an internal effort as well as an external effort. And externally, we really feel like this frame and approach helps to create a sense of movement building that we think can galvanize the philanthropic sector and inspire others to take action. We think it helps us to develop explicit results and be able to collect and track data so that we can measure the impact of our investments and hold ourselves accountable in this work. Next slide. So in 2014, some of you may have been aware that we launched a Race for Results report, which for us included an index which was based on 12 key indicators that measure a child's success in each stage of life from birth through young adulthood. And it also considers the impact of family structure, parental education level, neighborhood and family income on their opportunities for success. And we chose these particular indicators based on the goal that all children should grow up in economically successful families, live in supportive communities, and meet developmental health and educational milestones. So disaggregating data on each of the indicators by race and ethnicity really allows us to understand the challenges that children of color face in meeting these milestones. And just recently, we've adopted these 12 milestones as a way for us to measure and track the foundation's commitment in this work and to also hold ourselves accountable. So we've recently used these indicators as a part of our own results-based accountability framework that's leading and guiding the foundation's work in this space. Next slide. So when we looked at those 12 indicators from the Race for Results report last year, what we found is that when we compiled them into a single score and we placed them on a scale from 0 to 1,000, with 0 being the lowest, of course, and 1,000 being the highest, you can clearly see that there's no one racial group that has all children meeting all milestones at the national level. Some kids are meeting some milestones, but we do see some big differences by race. And so for us, it was important for us to really disaggregate the data to see how kids were faring so that we knew how best to target our resources and investments. And so you can clearly see here that Asian and Pacific Islander children have the highest scores in the index at 776. Not too far behind are white children, right around 700. Much farther behind, you can see our Latino children who are just barely at 400, and you can see that African American and American Indian children have scores way down in the 300s. So, you know, it's really here that the data in the report reveal that the odds are stacked against children of color who, along with their families, face, you know, very steep obstacles to equitable opportunity. So again, these are the disaggregated numbers that is really driving the foundation's efforts and really sharpening our focus on how to target and resources our investment in resources to really help improve the outcomes for kids of color. Next slide. So what you see here is, you know, just a snapshot of a few of the tools and resources that we're making available, and we're developing a range of tools and resources to meet people's needs for wherever they are. And on the far left of the screen, you'll see the Race for Results report that I referenced earlier. This was a report that we launched last year this time that really paints a picture around the structural barriers that exist in our country that are preventing kids of color and their families from achieving full success in life. And so we use that report to really help to change or hopefully amplify the need to address issues around equity and inclusion, but also change the national narrative around the structural barriers that are preventing kids of color and families of color from succeeding. On the far right, you'll see we also launched last year a Race, Equity, and Inclusion Action Guide, which includes 7 key steps for how institutions and organizations can really begin to embed race, equity, and inclusion into their work and really propel their organizations to move forward with integrating a race equity lens in their work. In the middle, we instituted a racial equity and inclusion assessment tool where we're using to really help assess where our own KC staff are and our units are in this work, and it helps us to figure out what are the series of conversations we need to put into place so that we can all do a better job of advancing race, equity, and inclusion throughout our foundation's work. I'll also say that over the last year, we've also made being race equity informed a core competency for all KC staff that will be used in our annual performance review system. So now, beginning in 2016, all KC staff will need to have race, equity, and inclusion goals, work goals, and they will also be rated on sort of how they're performing on being race informed. We're providing race, equity, and inclusion training for all of our staff that will be mandatory. So it's not just like a one-time deal. This is a way that we will onboard all staff and new staff, but also providing consistent training really to make sure that our staff have the key knowledge, skills, and understanding of these issues so that they can really help inform and influence the decision-making and the authority they have to make grants in very particular ways. We also provide our staff with diversity data on their grantees and consultants so that they also can see wealth allocation and how they're spending their resources, and encouraging our staff to really think clearly about, are the current grantees we have ones that are helping us get the results we seek? And if they aren't, we feel like that's an opportunity for our staff to use their grantee diversity data, take a look at it, and identify other more diverse organizations who our staff can partner with to help them reach their results and portfolio-related results. Next slide. So, I know I shared a lot with you guys, but what I'll just like to end with here are just a few lessons learned for us. And I'll say that, CEO buy-in and leadership is critical. It wasn't until just a few short years ago that our president really began to embrace this notion of equity and inclusion and become more comfortable saying that it is a key and mission-critical component of our work. And it wasn't until, again, probably in the last year or so when we launched the Race for Results report that our president really began to see how critical this work is to us achieving our mission. And it was at the end of last year in December where our president stated that race, equity, and inclusion is one of our top foundation-wide priorities. We've been doing this work for about 20 years, and we've been trying our hardest over the last 20 years to really make it a priority of the foundation and a priority of the Office of the President, and it hasn't happened until just recently. So leadership, we think, and CEO buy-in is critical to really advancing the work and moving it forward. The other point I want to make here is around being explicit and intentional in the work. Our argument was that for years, we just felt like by default, because we wanted to help improve the lives of disadvantaged kids, then we were already working to address race, equity, and inclusion in our work. And you know what? That's not the way it works. And so our discussion over the last few years about we need to make it front and center. We need to be explicit about it. And we need to be intentional about talking about race and lifting up race and the intersection between race, equity, and opportunity in America and all of our portfolio-related results. You can't just assume that addressing disadvantaged populations means that you're addressing issues of race. And so we've become more clear and more comfortable with that notion just recently. The next point is around walking the talk. And for us, we've been talking about this work for a very long time. It's only recently have we began looking internally and trying to figure out not just what our grantees and other partners are doing to turn the curves around race equity in our work, but what are we doing as an institution? How are we, what policies and practices do we have in place, and how are we even comfortable within our own walls having authentic conversations about race? And so we've had some really hard times over the last, I would say, few years that I've been leading the work, but we think it's okay to be uncomfortable in this space, and I think I've been encouraging our folks to lean into that discomfort and just acknowledge the fact that this is hard work, but it's the right work to be doing. And the final point I'd just like to make is that we have made a lot of progress in this work and focusing on race equity and inclusion, but we still have a long ways to go. We're still on a long journey, but I feel like now we have a very clear roadmap that clearly defines our destination in a very inspiring way. So with that, I will end and turn it to Edward.
Well, thank you, Nanette. Actually, I would like to go back, Bianca, to the last slide, just to hold it there for a moment. And then also remind everyone that if you have any questions, please post the questions in the chat on the lower right side, and we will field those questions momentarily. There was so much rich information in what you just shared, Nanette, as you look at not just the work as a funder and how you see yourself and how you do work externally, but the idea of how you bring that work also internally and recognize that you got to, as you say here, walking the talk is hard work. You really have to walk the talk internally, and I think that's just such a rich opportunity for people to really understand. You can't just, it's not one of those, do as I say, not as I do practices, but it's really one that I got to practice what I preach. And I say all that and lead into the question of, where have you seen challenges? Where have you found people to be stuck on the internal aspects of the work and the external, actually?
So, of course, we've had our fair share of challenges along the way, and I'll say, there are a few folks here who still don't understand why we need to pay close attention to race, and why is it, race and not class, since, poverty is huge around the work that we do here at Casey. So trying to convince people and help them understand why we should focus on race and not class has been one of the most sticky points that we've had to encounter, I would say, throughout the history of this work. And my response to that is, like, even if when you control for income and you look at the, low-income families and you look at the poorest of the poor and you disaggregate that data by race, 9 times out of 10, people of color will still be at the bottom. They will still be the ones lagging behind. So helping to convince my colleagues and others in the field, quite honestly, of why we should focus on race and not class has been one of the key challenges in this work. Another, challenge that we've had recently was one of our staff said, well, aren't we being discriminatory with our race equity and inclusion work? If we're only going to target our resources and investments to populations of color and people of color, isn't that discriminatory? What about the rural populations? What about Appalachia? What about, other demographics that have, some of the same challenges around poor economic and social and health outcomes? And so, again, trying to make the case for why it's a race focus and not a class focus and not an income focus, and how targeting our investments and resources is not discriminatory. we want all children to succeed. We want all families to do well. But we know that there are folks. Can you still hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Oh, okay. Okay. And so I think for us, it's being strategic and thoughtful with the limited resources that we have. Is to let's try to improve outcomes by targeting our investments and targeting our resources to those populations that need them the most. And so in that vein, I don't think our work is discriminatory, but there are folks that we had to do some convincing around that. So those are just a few of the challenges we've seen.
Well, I appreciate that honesty and the idea that as this has become a part of your organizational structure, it seems like that those will be they will be managed appropriately by the idea that this becomes a part of the culture and it's something that has to be embedded, not just something that is just put out there and then put on a shelf. And it seems like you guys are really going in that direction. Have you found a change in how the organization is perceived in the eyes of the grantee partners as you talk more about this racial equity and inclusion work?
Yeah, I have actually seen our grantee partners embrace this notion. There were some who have been doing this work for a while, and they were leading the charge, and they were waiting for us to catch up, quite honestly. And for some of those, it's a breath of fresh air, and it's, they're honored that we are joining them in the struggle. And so for some others, they, needed a bit of convincing. But for the most part, our grantee partners are totally okay with us focusing on issues of race, equity, and inclusion. And for them, it really helps us to help them narrow their focus in the grant dollars that they get from the Casey Foundation. Just recently, we had one of our grantees who was focused on a number of different issues around poverty and opportunity, and when we told them we wanted them to focus on race, equity, and inclusion, they felt like it was just great news that they could target their resources in their own work in this way. And they gave us a number of different examples of how this helped them to sharpen their focus and sharpen their focus on results by focusing their efforts on race, equity, and inclusion. So a lot of our grantees have embraced this notion. We're also providing our grantees and partners with training as necessary, helping them to become comfortable with the concepts, the terms, the principles associated with this work. They are coming to us for training, coming to us requesting technical assistance and coaching for some that don't fully get it but want to get it. They're asking us for some support to help them in this work. So most of our grantees and partners are embracing it. We haven't had many that I'm aware of right now who have pushed back in any way.
Gotcha. I appreciate that. I'm going to turn it over to the questions that have come in because there's some interesting questions that I think are starting to come in from outside. But I want to ask one other question real quick, and that is kind of getting back to some work that we've been doing. So ABFE has been doing this work around REPC, like racial, this whole idea of responsible philanthropy in Black communities, REPC, and we want to be thoughtful about how that plays out, right? We want to make sure that people understand that there does require a level of competency around understanding cultural specific issues in communities if you really want to be most effective in your philanthropic dollars. Also to that end, there's been a lot of energy around issues such as there's a network of folks around Black Lives Matter and philanthropy. And it kind of bridges the report that we had done last year at ABFE called the Exodus Review, where we got feedback from our network through our Black Philanthropic Network of regional groups that are professionals in the field of philanthropy who are on the front lines, and they're in communities and in organizations that are not necessarily taking this approach. And in those conversations, there have been some real honest discussions around people just saying they are somewhat skittish around even bringing up the issues of race in their communities, in their workplace, because of the lack of support systems there. They may be the only, still in this day and age, the only black person or a person of color or a person that is in the space that does not feel comfortable in addressing the issues of race because of what they probably observed, as well as some reluctance that seems to be more evident where people want to do that pushback, such as what you use as an example. What about the other people? What about the other group that needs attention? As if to suggest it's either or as opposed to both and. Mm-hmm. Can you give some guidance on how you all do lean into this work, how you do individually, how some of your colleagues lead in and go in with a level of real honesty and boldness around bringing these conversations to the forefront? Yeah,
and I do think it takes a level of courage and boldness. And, it wasn't too long ago that, we didn't have a whole lot of program officers of color here at the Casey Foundation. And we developed respect, our internal affinity group. And it wasn't just people of color on that affinity group. There were white folks on there. In fact, one of the people who helped spearhead respect was a white male. And so I think it's, for those lone program officers of color, you need to be, again, finding your allies and champions around the work. So they might show up in different shades and sizes, but, the white male, the white female, the baby boomers, other program officers of color might be allies and champions in the work. And I would say begin to have just conversations with folks and see where they stand. And once you change the perspective, I think, on one or two of them, and they begin to have conversations with others, I think you will begin to build a contingency of folks who are standing with you on this work. It doesn't happen overnight, so don't expect great change overnight. Again, we've been at this work for probably 20-plus years now, but change does happen. So I would say, stand steadfast in the work, begin sort of like a grassroots community organizing movement, build some champions and allies to support you with it. And then I agree, I really think that it's the affinity groups that really help to sustain the work. They could provide you the cover that's necessary if the one lone program officer doesn't feel comfortable lifting up and raising up the issues of equity. But it has to start somewhere. And so if you are that one program officer, have a conversation with somebody else who you think may share some similar views and perspectives. Engage them in the conversation. Don't be shy. State your opinions and values and see where it goes. And you'd be surprised at the kind of change that can happen.
Great advice, for sure. Thank you for that. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Bianca, who has some questions that are in the queue. And Bianca, just start with the next question for Lynette.
Thank you, Edward. I do have some questions here for Lynette that I am going to share. The first question would be, is the REI guide focused only on improving educational outcomes, or is it a global focused guide around the REI?
So the Race, Equity, and Inclusion Action Guide is a globally focused guide. It's not focused on any particular population level outcome. It really is providing you with 7 clear steps on how to get started with advancing equity and inclusion within your own organization. When we launched our Race for Results report last April, so many people thought that the information we provided in the report, the data in the report, the recommendations in the report were all great. So many people said, though, we just want to know how to get started and where to get started, which is what prompted us to develop the Race, Equity, and Inclusion Action Guide. So it does include 7 concrete steps for getting started in the work. And the very first step is around establishing a common language around the work. The next one is around engaging stakeholders. So there is not focused on a particular outcome such as education or health. It really is sort of how do you figure out how to begin embedding race, equity, and inclusion in your work, and how you apply that lens to any particular portfolio that you may have.
Excellent. Thank you, Lynette. I'm going to move on to the next question. And that question is, how did Annie E. Casey arrive at this framework? and where can one find those sorts of options if they want to weigh it at their own foundations or organizations?
We arrived at this framework, like I said earlier in the presentation, through a series of consultative sessions. Those are opportunities where we get our grantees and partners and stakeholders and thought partners around the table, and we ask several effective questions, and we are just there to listen to figure out what's the right space and the right role for us to play and what's the right framework. We did a lot of research. We talked to Kellogg. We interviewed Kellogg. We researched their America Healing Initiative. We looked at some of the other foundations, Ford, the California Endowment, San Francisco Foundation, and others, to really figure out what they were doing, what their results they were seeking, and to figure out, based on Casey's niche and Casey's area of expertise, where does it make sense for us to play in this space, and what's the right framework for us. And so, you know, we looked at the leading frameworks that we saw in the field, which was around, you know, changing demographics, closing disparity gaps. And we feel like we had been in that closing disparity gap space for a while. And it felt like when I took over this portfolio in 2011, it was really an opportunity for us to take a step back to evaluate and assess whether the closing disparity framework and that approach really worked for us, whether we had seen any kind of clear results, and we felt like it was an opportunity to rethink and to reframe the work going forward. And for us, the Equitable Opportunities Frame was one that was appealing not only to our senior leadership team, but also to our board. It was, as John Powell would put it, a really targeted universalism approach to the work. We were still talking about helping to improve outcomes for all kids, but the Equitable Opportunities Framework, the focus really is, and for those kids that are lagging behind, those kids who need those resources the most, how can we really provide opportunities for them so that they have the resources and the conditions necessary for them to thrive? So we did a lot of research in the field. We had a lot of conversations with a lot of people, and it was about a year-and-a-half-long process before we arrived at the framework, the Equitable Opportunities Framework.
Well, that's good guidance. And to that end, you and I before the call, and actually the team before the call, we were talking about this race equity philanthropy group that has been doing some work for the past several years. And it's a network of funders that are also doing this work. They are practitioners of racial equity engagement within their own foundations, and they've been using that group as a means of collaboration, means of conversation to understand how and what people are doing, what's working, to identify best practices. And that group is going to actually join us in a conversation in Napa for an informal conversation. So for those of you that are going to join us in Napa at the now sold out conference, that may be another way to plug in there.
What I'll just say about the REPG, Edward, and we think it's a fabulous affinity group to partner with, because you realize that you're not alone in this work. There are other program officers who are trying to do this work, who are there to share their lessons learned, to encourage you, to share their challenges and their successes with you. So that is truly a place where you can go and figure out what's working. And it was through the Race and Equity and Philanthropy Group meetings where, at the time, Kellogg was sharing with us when they were thinking about their America Healing work and really sharing the work that they did to lead them toward that particular frame and approach, and the conversations that they had internally and the conversations they needed to have with their board and how they needed to frame their portfolio in a way that would be appealing and not turn off other grantees and investors. And so that was the space that we really used to figure out what was working. And to hear from Kellogg, who is in this space and who have been doing it a while, you know, some things that we might need to consider. So we found that affinity group and that space very helpful to us as we really sought to figure out our next steps in the work.
Great, thank you. What's the next question, Bianca?
The next question is, does Annie E. Casey focus on the origins of racial disparities in this work?
So that's an interesting question. So we So we are, an easy answer, I guess, would say no, we're not focusing on the origins of racial disparities in the work. We did lift up and help to inform all of our staff around the structural barriers that are perpetuating the inequities. So yes, in that vein, you have to think about the history of our culture and all of the policies that are in place that perpetuate inequity. But for us, we are still trying to help our program officers who are leading portfolios of work to apply an equity lens to their work. So we're not asking them, because it would be absurd to ask them to not fund what they're currently funding. We're saying, given that your focus is juvenile justice system reform, for example, or child welfare reform, or family and economic security work, how can you apply an equity lens to your work so that you make sure that you're targeting those populations of folks who need them most? And so for our juvenile justice work, clearly with their juvenile detention alternatives initiatives, they're already looking at the overrepresentation of kids of color in the juvenile justice system. And so right now they're partnering with school systems and others to really think about the school suspension policies and how those policies are really setting kids up to enter the juvenile justice system. And so there are ways that each portfolio and each program officer has the ability to look at some of the root causes to the disparities. But we're asking them, given their portfolio that they're currently managing, please apply an equity lens to your work. Please think about grantee diversity and how you can partner with organizations that are led by people of color to help you achieve the results in your work. So we're really trying to meet our program officers where they are and provide them with the tools, the resources, and supports that are necessary to help them achieve their portfolio-related results, as well as helping me to achieve my desired results around race equity and inclusion.
No, that's rich. That's really important, Annette. I'll add just as information for folks that it is a part of our work with our responsive philanthropy in Black communities framework and trainings that we really do introduce some of the root causes. And we go back, interesting, to the GI Bill through the video some of you may have seen. It's called Race, the Power of an Illusion. That really gets to the heart of a lot of the work, as Annette has been talking about, the work that John Powell and others have done, but really digging deeper into the understanding of where a lot of the policies of yesteryear are still influencing and have created and influenced where we are today on so many different levels. And so the idea of meeting people where they are and then also giving them context is definitely a great way to help folks get more deeply grounded in understanding what that work is and what it looks like and what needs to be changed, honestly. What's the next question, Bianca?
The next question is, as you work with community leaders, how do you support them in articulating what they're already doing around supporting equity work to align with the Foundation's goals?
So we really do encourage our program officers to play that role. And so an example of this is that we do have a few place-based sites, so Baltimore and Atlanta, Cleveland, and Buffalo and San Antonio are some of our place-based sites, and we arm our program officers working with those sites with the knowledge, the skills, and the resources necessary so that they can engage their grantees in those sites in a particular way. And so, for an example, our Baltimore team works very closely with the grantees in Baltimore, and some of our grantees here in Baltimore have been doing this work for a long time. So it's just about how do they support the grantees currently doing the work, and how do the grantees really help reinforce and support our program officers who may not be real comfortable in this space. And so in some instances, our grantees are really stepping up and helping to lead the work in partnership with our program officers in some of our place-based sites.
Great.
Okay, thank you very much again, Annette. I will go ahead and move on as we're still getting questions. Do you work with your local regional association of grantmakers on advancing this work? And if you do, what role do they play in supporting your work and the work of the foundations in your region?
That's a great question, and I feel like it's almost a prompt, and I failed to mention this. So I am on the board of our regional association. So it's the Association of Baltimore Area Grantmakers, and I also serve as the co-chair of our Diversity and Inclusion Committee of the Association of Baltimore Area Grantmakers, and they are a huge partner with us in the work. They participated, all of the board went through a Race Matters training about, I want to say, a year ago now. They also went through a training on back map analysis and how to better understand the root causes of the disparities that we're seeing. And I would say it's also the program chairs and the program committees of our regional foundation are also working closely with us in advancing the work. So ABAG is a close partner. We're always thinking about, as a committee, how do we help inform our local funders in the area, and what tools and resources can we make available to them. And so we work with our program committee at ABAG to really pull together webinars and information sessions and brown bag lunch discussions on issues of race, equity, and inclusion, and how funders can be more comfortable having these conversations and really beginning to target their resources and investments. And the Baltimore Community Foundation is another great ally and partner in the work. They are also a part of ABAG, but they have, over the last several years, taken their board and their staff through this work, and they are all they are great examples and a great organization to look to in terms of how you can become a truly transformative in this work. It started with a conversation at the board level, and now that they are training their grantees in race, equity, and inclusion as well. And so they are also a great example of a local community foundation that's doing great work in this space. And ABAG is a true partner in the work as well.
Great to hear. I just should add, because I know that folks are in from all over the country, that there are some other cities that are starting this work at different levels. Philadelphia just recently took part in a similar conversation that had the Regional Association, local funders, the Philadelphia Foundation, all in the same room with similar trainings, as well as in Milwaukee, Louisville, and Kansas City. So there's really a growing movement around this work. So that's a really great prompt to think about, how do you start assembling, even if it comes from other folks outside of your own organization, to start building that kind of momentum and conversation so that it does become one that's more embedded in the communities that you supported. What's the next question, Bianca?
Have you seen any increase in the grant funding of explicitly racial equity focused work?
So I will say for my portfolio has doubled in terms of the grant funding to support the work. When I came on, I had a little less than $1 million targeted toward this work, and now that pool of funds has doubled. I will also say, in addition to my grant-specific dollars to advance the work, because the foundation has made it one of its top priorities, our president's expectation is that every portfolio within the foundation will have some race, equity, and inclusion strategy or approach to their work. So that means that all of our 27 portfolios here will have some strategy, which means that they will be targeting some portion of their grant dollars to advance this work as well. So yes, we've seen that the grant resources committed to this work has increased exponentially over the last couple of years.
Thank you, Nanette. The next question is, do you encourage white staff and allies to engage in explorations of white privilege so they can be more effective in the REI?
Yes, we do. It's actually a part of the Race Matters training, and for those of you who are not familiar with it, who have not participated in it, I would ask you to reach out to the Race Matters Institute. It's one of the topics and one of the concepts that they explore in their day-and-a-half Race Matters training. And we actually took our senior leadership team through the Race Matters training at their recent retreat in February, and we had a healthy conversation on white privilege to the extent that now they want to have a standalone, a follow-up session to have a deeper conversation on white privilege and the role that plays and how that shapes this conversation. And I mentioned earlier that we're designing a race equity and inclusion trainings for all of our staff, and white privilege is one of the 4 key components of the training that we will take all staff through. The other one is on unconscious bias. There's another segment on understanding a systems analysis and approach to the work. And the 4th and final component of the training is focused on how do you facilitate racial equity conversations with grantees and partners. So we believe white privilege is a key component of understanding and advancing the work.
The next question is, have you been able to fund research that directly addresses the root causes of racial inequity and or make historical connections for clearer understanding of racial inequity in our institutions and in the country as a whole?
We have done some research or funded some research, and I'm looking to see. You guys know that Casey does a lot of, makes a lot of grants to support this kind of research, and we give grants to the Center for American Progress, to Brookings, to DEMOS, to the Institute for the Advancement of Social Policy and others to do this really granular look at what are the benefits of applying a race equity lens to the work. How can we, as a country, improve economic opportunity? And so I think there's numbers of them, and at the moment I'm blanking on one in particular, but we fund quite a bit of research to not just on the root causes, but also why it matters, why closing the racial wealth gap matters, and how that can improve our gross domestic product numbers and others. So partners like DEMOS and IASP and CAP are close-in partners who help us do that kind of research.
Excellent.
And if you have other information, you can share that with us as you think about other resources, and we can make that available in the resource document that we'll make available probably soon after the conference.
Absolutely.
The following question is, what is the relationship between Annie and Casey and public institutions, and how do you partner with them to maximize philanthropic and public sector resources?
State the question one more time, Bianca, please.
No problem. The question is, what is the relationship between what is your Annie E. Casey's relationship with public institutions, and how do you partner with them to maximize philanthropic and public sector resources?
Yeah, so we have great relationships with public institutions, and we probably have them in just about every portfolio of the work that we do. And what we try to do is really think about what is the intersection. So if I would provide an example in our juvenile justice work, where we have several juvenile detention alternative initiative sites that are partnering with the criminal justice system, and how they're working to help reduce the overrepresentation of kids of color. And so we do the same thing in our child welfare reform work, and how the Department of Social Services and Human Services are also institutions that we partner with to reduce the overrepresentation of kids of color in the child welfare system, or to make sure that kids of color are placed in kinship care rather than just random group homes or other kind of foster care. And so we do a lot of partnering with public institutions to maximize our portfolio-related results. I'm not sure if that fully answers the question, but they're one of our key partners and stakeholders in our work.
thank you again, Annette. This will be the last question, and it's not necessarily a question, but just an ask, if it's possible for you to maybe go deeper into the rationale for race over class. An example that was referenced here is Black urban areas versus Appalachia, for example.
Right, and so for us, again, and I will try to dig up the article and send it to you, Edward, to post with some of the other materials. For us, you know, it's all about the importance of disaggregating the data. And really, it's not just about class, because even when you control for class and you control for income, you'll see that people of color are often still at the bottom of the list, those who are lagging farthest behind. And for us, it is about race and not about class, because even within class, people of color are oftentimes always doing and bearing the worst. So that's why we focus on race. And there's an article or two, I think, and John Powell might have authored one of them that I'll be able to share with you guys to help sort of put a pin in that point.
Thank you so much for bringing this conversation in to an appropriate close. We know the conversation and this work doesn't just begin. I totally appreciate how you shared the 20-year-plus long journey that Annie Casey has embarked upon with this work. For those that are thinking about this is another 3 or 5 year grant cycle experience, but it's deeper than that, and it requires so much more. You gave us so much to chew on in the amount of time that you shared this with us, but we know the conversation continues. And I invite people on the call, if you want to continue the conversation or if you have additional questions, let's use the hashtag embracing equity or ABFE. I can use ABFE, hashtag ABFE or at ABFE on Twitter to post questions, but also to continue the conversation so that there is a way for us to really think through how do we become, it's all about embedding this into our work to help influence so it doesn't become, again, another one of these either or propositions, but as you noted, and that is the mission of Annie Casey is improving outcomes for everyone. Now, if it takes the as John Powell calls, the targeted universalism of doing that, then so be it, but understanding that we can improve lives for everyone through their work. And so I just want to thank you again, Annette, for sharing this. I want to congratulate you on your new position of Director of Race, Equity, and Inclusion. I'm sorry you won't be with us in Napa, but I know some of your colleagues will be, and I know from that experience and all the work that's going to go on that this work continues. And, hopefully we should come back and revisit this conversation as often as necessary so that people do understand it's a work that is not a short-term but a long-term commitment.
Thank you, Edward. I appreciate being here.
All right, everyone. Have a great day. Continue to work towards embracing equity in your workplaces. And if you don't know how to do it, you've gotten some great lessons. Check in with us at ABFE as well as the Racial Equity Philanthropy Group. More information on that, and we invite you to submit your survey responses. You will get a survey electronically. We want you to give us your feedback as we prepare for the next webinar on our Third Thursday series. Have a great day, all.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.